Good evening. It's good to see everybody out tonight. If you have a Bible or a device, you know where we're headed. I invite you to go to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17. While you're turning there, we have great news. I was going to mention this during our announcements, but I want to make sure she was in here. We have a new sister in Christ. We had a baptism right before worship tonight. Our sister Deborah right behind the Harveys. Right there. Yes. That's Deborah. She had the opportunity to study with the Harveys and with William and others, and decided to put on Christ in baptism tonight. So we have a new sister. So after worship, go give her a hug and welcome her to the family of God. But tonight we're going to look in 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17. If you've been with us through this, we're kind of doing a textual overview of 1 and 2 Samuel, and we are to one of the great, certainly most told stories in the Old Testament. Now, that is great in one sense, that you have probably heard the entirety of 1 Samuel 17, maybe not verse by verse, but you know the story of what's coming. But I'll tell you that probably poses a challenge in some ways as well. We think we're super familiar with this story. This is going to be David and Goliath. So here's my challenge and my proposition to you is, consider 1 Samuel 17 like you would any of the other chapters that we've went through, right? Not as a standalone story, but as a part of a much grander narrative, right? So let's forget what we think we know, right? You're going to allow that to inform some of it, but consider this just in the kind of weekly cycle of we looked in 16, and you remember again, David is now anointed as king. My hope for you is that 17, David and Goliath, will be an even more incredible of a story as we know the grander context of this, right? You know, God continuing to stay with Israel and Samuel as a prophet, and then, you know, the Spirit of the Lord departing from Saul and going into David, right? All of that history builds up to now, and in some ways should make David and Goliath not less amazing, but really should provide some context of God has picked David as his appointed as king, right? And so again, still incredible what David's about to do, but shouldn't come as a shock, certainly as we get into this text. Now, 1 Samuel 17 is long. It's almost 60 verses long. So we may not get through all of that tonight, but that's okay. We're going to get as far as we can. And I'd like to read most of this because, again, this is in some ways a culmination, one of the culminations in David's life. When you start looking through the kind of periods of David's life, this is one of the really kind of big cornerstones. And we're going to kind of go through this. So I don't want to shortchange this. Plus, it's a super cool story that you're probably familiar with anyway. So let's read the first 10 verses here. The first 10 verses. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and they gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and they camped around Socoh, and Elkanah and Ephas Damim, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah. Now if you look, that valley, and I meant to grab a picture of it and I forgot, but if you Google that, that's still very much a valley geographically, topography-wise today. And it's amazing because it's this giant open field with two really tall peaks kind of in each side, creating this valley. And so the best we can figure is that each side took up one of those hills and basically look down into this middle where all the fighting would end up taking place. And it's interesting that that's still there, and you can see that even still today. They drew up in battle against the Philistines, and the Philistines stood on a mountain on each side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley beneath them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, and had a bronze helmet on his hand, and was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. And he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come up out of line for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you will be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Now again, this is the setup of what is going to be just an epic story. And I mean that kind of as an adjective, but also really in many ways for Israel is going to be a epic tale that is going to spread like wildfire, that is going to really run ahead of David. David's not going to immediately become king. In fact, we still have a little bit of time between Saul and David, but these are going to be the stories that are going to fuel a lot of the love that's going to generate in Israel for David. But you have Goliath coming out, and again, they're sitting their champion out, right, from the Philistines, who's Goliath, this huge man. The interesting about this is he was undeniably tall. Every biblical and secular historian agrees that he was a huge man. But what's interesting is the Masoretic text is what many are translated. The ESV comes out of that and translated 6 cubits in a span, which is roughly almost 10 feet tall, 9.5 feet. And that's where we get the giant Goliath. But if you go back and you look at the Septuagint, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are other texts that the Bible can be translated from, even the historian Josephus records it as 4 cubits in a span, which is about 6'10", 6'11", still a huge man, even by today's standards, would be a mountain of an individual, certainly compared to an Israelite that probably was somewhere in the 5-foot range, would have been about average at that time. So he was feet ahead of the biggest man. But again, was he 10 feet tall? Maybe. I mean, that is, again, the ESV pulls from and says 6 cubits in a span, which is, like I said, about 18 inches each. So that's pretty close to 10 foot. But maybe not. He could have just been like 7 foot tall, which is still a really big guy. But again, we go down through this. He's from Gath. Right? And we can read about this even in Joshua chapter 11, talks about the people of the Anakim from, that was hundreds of years prior, but the city of Gath seemed to produce these huge people, and we see that even throughout the historical narrative. So Goliath is a Philistine from Gath. That should inform us as who he is. Most biblical historians will say that his armor probably weighed approximately 150 to 200 pounds. Again, if he was close to 10 feet tall, 200 pounds would have been nothing. Even if he were 7 foot tall, he was a really, really big man. And of course, David is eventually going to go out and stand toe-to-toe against him. So this is just really prostrating in many ways before Israel. He's taunting them, right? Send out your best. Right, he's going to do this for weeks on end. Send out your best, and he can fight me. And if he beats me, we'll be subservient to you. But of course, there's always the catch. But if not, right, if we beat him, then you are going to become our slaves as well. All right, let's look into verse 11, because really that first 10 verses just is giving us a little bit of background where this is all happening and most about Goliath. Verse 11 begins where it begins to kind of gets interesting as far as God's concerned, because we're going to see Saul's posture to this. Now remember, the key of last week, you remember that the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. We talked last week about what all that meant. One of the keys of that is courage. Saul, because you would look back and you think, isn't the reason Saul was one of the great picks to be king is he's a military leader? Why is this making him lose his mind? Well, because remember, he was a great leader because the Spirit of the Lord was with him to make him a great military leader. That leaves, and everything that is great about Saul left with it. Right? And so in many senses, from chapter 16 to 17, Saul is not the same man that he was just a chapter prior, right? It's important to note that we didn't have just some great, personality change for the sake of it. Scripture tells us what's different between the two times. So let's read verse 11 together. When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and they were greatly afraid. This was Goliath's exact hope, to strike fear from Saul and let it trickle all the way down into the nation of Israel. Again, he came out with full battle equipment, right? Did he really expect that they were going to, on the spot, send somebody out to fight him? Probably not, course, I doubt he would have cared if they had. That's going to come back to get him in a minute because they are going to send out David, and we know the end of that story. But he's proud enough that he thinks nobody that they're going to send is going to do anything to me. I'm going to go out in full gear to make them afraid of what is coming. Again, Goliath is defeating the Israelites with fear alone. Not a single sword has gotten brought out yet, and the Philistines are already winning. You know, it's interesting that as I was thinking through this, and there's almost a whole nother lesson in this, but this is one of the great strategies that Satan employs as well. Right, to prostrate out before, to make us fearful of what could be, in hope that we just give in, right? That we don't even try. Certainly what Goliath did, and he was doing well. Again, Saul heard these words, and you got to think, why was Saul so afraid? Saul particularly, right? Goliath's challenge is send out your best. Presumably, what does that mean? He's saying send out your biggest. Send out your strongest. Send out your A+ level. Send out your version of me. And again, you go back to 1 Samuel 9, you recognize that Saul is Goliath for Israel. He was head and shoulders above every other man. Again, most historians will tell you that Saul is about probably 6 foot tall. Again, if the average Israelite was probably 5 foot something, and he was heads and shoulders above it, he could have been 6'1", 6'2". I mean, a tall guy, but not 10 feet tall, not even 7 feet tall. Saul, out of self-preservation here, is getting nervous because, again, on paper, he's probably the choice. He's the king, he's the warrior, he's physically bigger than everybody else, and he doesn't want to go out there. As the battle loomed on, Saul grew more and more dismayed at this, right? He was once this fierce military leader. You go back to 1 Samuel 14 and we read this. But 1 Samuel 16 and verse 14, and I told you to highlight that in your Bible, that is a turning point in Saul's life, in David's life, and in Israel as a whole, right? It was, for all intents and purposes, the change of power. And we're going to see that put on full display here. All right, let's keep reading, because again, we'll move at a relatively brisk pace, because we're not even halfway through it yet. 12 through 15. Now David was the son of an Ephraite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. And in the day of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in year, and the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul into battle. And the name of his 3 sons who went into the battle were Eliab the firstborn, Abinadab the next to him, and third was Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep in Bethlehem. You know, again, I think the only thing of interest here is recognizing that David, I think often we imagine, myself included, that once Saul wanted David to come into the kingdom to be his music player, right? We saw that in chapter 15 and chapter 16. I think everybody assumes that he stayed there, right? That seems logical, but Scripture tells us that he went back and forth, right? It seems like David was only called to the palace as needed, which explains a little bit here in 20 or 30 verses after David is going to kill Goliath. Saul is going to say something to the effect of, show me the man, find me the man that did this, right? And people read that and think, how does Saul not know? It's David. How does he not know that it's David? Well, partly it's because he probably doesn't see him regularly. There's probably big spans where David is gone and is out in the fields tending to the sheep still. So it's not like that they're staying side by side and are together all the time. We'll talk more about why else Saul may not have known exactly who David was. But he comes back and forth. So let's pick up in verse 16. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. Now again, imagine this, that Israel's on one side, the Philistines are on the other, and this giant man for 40 days prances around down in this valley, full armor, mocking not only Israel, but the God of Israel, right? And David's going to take great offense to this. Saul is still thinking in terms of X's and O's, military, and that's, again, when David's going to come forward, he's going to offer him, take my armor. And David's going to recognize and say, King Saul, it's not that, right? It's not the armor. It's not the X's and O's. It's God. And that's the problem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers of this parched grain and these 10 loaves and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. And take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well and take some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. They presented, again, Goliath is presenting himself for 40 days. What I want you to pay particular attention to is a kind of a Passover line, something that you would easily gloss over if you didn't just particularly pay attention to it. But look back in verse, let's look here. 20. David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper. I want you to underline that line, left the sheep with a keeper. There's a lot of foreshadowing that happens in the life of David, foreshadowing him as king, connection, and we'll actually end tonight's lesson, or next week, potentially how far we go, looking at all the parallels between Jesus and David. But one of the great observations is, again, we see the shepherd's heart of David. Even in the midst of battle, even in the midst of coming back and forth to King Saul, right, when he left, he left the sheep with a shepherd. Right, if he left to do anything, he made sure that the sheep were cared for. Right, we see so many parallels to God and to David as king and to us. And he comes to this camp where they were fighting and shouting for 40 days, gathering on each hillside. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, verse 22, and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers, and he talked to them. Behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks and the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and they were afraid. All of Israel was afraid. No one wanted to go out in front of Goliath. Saul's going to up the ante. Let's keep reading in 25. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he could come up and defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God?" Now, I want you to pay attention to what is David adding to this equation. Again, they're all terrified of what Goliath is, what he's doing. David comes in, recognizes all of that, but David's main problem is right at the end of 26. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Forget his size, forget everything that everyone else is focusing in on. He says, who is he that he should defy the armies of the living God? We don't get a sense that Saul has ever connected the dots up to this point, that Goliath is coming out and mocking God. He's just afraid. Again, the Spirit of the Lord has left him already, but David is concerned with the important things. Saul is really offering what amounts to about a 3-part bribe in this, right? He's offering riches, cash, he's offering his daughter. And if you look in verse 25, right, and make his father's house free in Israel, that in the Hebrew really means like tax-free. So Saul is really offering money, a wife, and basically what amounts to tax exemption for anybody that will go and just handle this problem, right? Shows Saul's leadership style, but that's what he's trying to offer here. David comes in and says, who's going to take the reproach from Israel? Again, other soldiers are focused on the danger of battle, the material rewards to be won. It seems like David alone is focused on the honor of God and the reputation of Israel. Again, two very different leadership styles employed here. We begin to see that kind of David after a man after God's own heart. David saw things from God's perspective, while the men of Israel purely saw this from a physical perspective. Verse 28. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left the few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him as before. He was frustrated with David. I see 4 things that his older brother was frustrated by. He became angry because he felt David was insignificant, worthless, and had no right to show up. Why are you here? Again, David is the youngest of 8. What are you doing here? Right? We can almost read into this a sibling dynamic here. Second, he was angry because he knew David's motivation. He felt he did. But the problem is he really didn't know David's heart. Right? He thought he understood. David's just here to watch. Right? Because again, in his mind, David couldn't have anything to offer. So why are you here? Why are you here just to watch? He was angry because he thought David tried to provoke somebody else to fight Goliath. And he was angry because he knew David was right. When he was dismayed and afraid, the last thing in the world you want is someone telling you, go be courageous. Right? David is coming and trying to be encouraging, and they didn't want any of it. What have I done now? What is the cause? But again, David is more concerned with God's cause than his own feelings. You know, what's interesting here is right in these verses, if you kind of put brackets in your Bible from verse 28 through verse 30, and even down into about verse 32, you'll recognize that important things are happening here, right? David, in these next little couple verses, is going to be pressured by everybody else to just leave. Right, David, what are you doing here? But in many ways, David sticking around and standing up for what he knew to be right is really where the story of David and Goliath, where David begins to win this battle, right? Because we're going to see the temptation is going to be to leave, but David sticks around. Verse 31. When the word that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and will fight this Philistine." You know, in many ways, I think Saul grew even more frustrated. Because again, what had Goliath been asking? He said, bring out your best, bring out your strongest, bring out your biggest. And what Israel's going to offer is a teenage shepherd, right? We have to assume that Saul is thinking to himself, I mean, this is going to be a blip on the radar. This is not even going to move the needle, right? I mean, Goliath is just going to wipe David off the face of the planet. But what's interesting, another thing to note kind of as you read down through this, and we may not have time to read all of this, and we definitely won't tonight, but as you read down through the rest of 17, read in your mind's eye as David gets more and more bold as we get closer to time. Right, in the beginning, he's going to offer to Saul, let me go out, and basically saying, let me go out and give it a shot. Let me go defend the honor of the one true living God. Then he's going to get in battle and say, well, maybe let me go out and win this, right? And then he's going to stand face to face with Goliath and say, I'm going to kill you today. That is getting progressively more and more bold, but it's interesting that he always points out that he only has capacity at all because God is with him. He's going to tell Goliath to his face, you're going to die today, not because of me, but because of the one true living God that is in charge of all of this. Of course, Goliath is going to laugh and think, well, what is this teenager going to do? But David is going to go on, and this may be the last we get to today, 33 down through verse 37. And this is going to talk about the training in David's eyes as to what's going to make him qualified to go do this. I think Saul would have let him go no matter what because nobody else was stepping forward, but David is going to essentially give his qualifications, right? Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. That's interesting if you want to underline that. Just in not that many verses, after he kills Goliath, David is going to refer to him, or Saul is going to refer to David as a young man, right? In the Hebrew, what that means is a young 20-something. That's not David's stature in life, but basically somebody that's able to go be married, to fight in an army, right? In just a few verses, the way the how Saul addresses David is going to change. It starts with, you are but a youth. Basically, you're a child. This will be akin to calling him a toddler, right? You're a baby. You have nothing to offer. He, Goliath, has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, now listen, this is the beauty of this. Listen to what David responds back, because you'll notice where the source of all this comes from. But David said to Saul, your servant, talking about himself, used to keep sheep for his father. And when there was a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, and I went after him, and I struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. And your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. Again, why? Why does David care? David, in many ways, now, if Israel gets conquered by the Philistines, he's going to be impacted. But David isn't a soldier. He's off, could have stayed off as a shepherd, just tending to Saul. But notice why. Why does he want to enter into this? This uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. That phrase comes up over and over again. And David said, the Lord, notice this, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. That's amazing to come and recognize and say, Saul, I'm capable of this, not because of me, right? Saul is looking at him and saying, you're a child, right? You're disqualified. You have no age, you have no size, you have no experience. And David says, that may all be true, but I have one thing that you now don't. Again, he didn't phrase it this way, but he's saying, I've got God on my side. That is the X factor. Your servant has killed a lion and a bear. The interesting thing, again, we've talked all this time about God preparing David. That wasn't just a metaphorical, he was, right, in the leadership sense, but things like this give us a sense that God was placing things in David's life to literally prepare him for this moment, right? The lion and the bear and the things that he shouldn't have been able to handle, but he did. God prepared David to fight Goliath all his life up to this point. Your servant has killed the lion and the bear. And again, David's boldness is increasing as we go. You know, first, you go back and you look in the early parts of 17, he says, somebody should go fight Goliath, right? Then he says, well, let me go fight Goliath. And again, just in a few verses, he's going to say, now let me kill Goliath, as David is getting more and more bold for God. He says he delivered him from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear. He's going to deliver me from the hands of the Philistines as well. We'll pause there because we're almost out of time. But I encourage you to read. We're going to stop in verse, and I'll make a notation here. We'll stop in 38, and we'll go down through verse 58. So again, we still have 20 more verses to read. But I encourage you to think about, where do we place our trust in and our faith? Right, again, life in so many ways is much akin to what David is enduring now. On the surface, the world would suggest that we have one line of thinking. Again, Saul is the king of Israel and is saying and doing one thing, and David comes in and says, well, with God's help, let me go and do something entirely different, something better that's only possible if God's involved. You and I still have that opportunity, and what's especially amazing about this is when we get to recognize David's connection to God, and we still get that privilege through baptism to come and be a follower of Jesus that gets to come and have the same trust and faith that David did. If that's your need tonight, we'd love to help you with that, or maybe you just need prayers of this congregation, we'd love to help you with that as well. If we can do anything for you, would you come let us know about it?